What I wanted to talk about in this segment is this entire economic situation. I am very, very concerned. And there was a great article, Simon Johnson, former chief economist at the IMF and a professor at MIT in their School of Management, is quoted by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times yesterday. And the title of the article is "Cutting Back Financial Capitalism is America's Big Test." And he lays out a few things that are consistent with what Elizabeth Warren, who is in charge, she's the chairperson of the Congressional Oversight Panel on TARP, is saying. Now, what Elizabeth Warren is pointing out is that there are basically three ways to deal with insolvent banks, which is what we have right now. One is to put them into receivership, basically declare them bankrupt and have the government claim them, not even declare them bankrupt. They put them into receivership. In other words, nationalize them temporarily, have the government take them over. Sweden did this about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It worked out just fine. When they reprivatized their banks, they were actually profitable and they evaded a disaster. That's one way to do it. The second way to do it is to simply liquidate the banks, but do it in a way that protects not the stockholders, sorry, rich fat cats, not the CEOs and executives, sorry, rich fat cats, but does protect the depositors. We're going to take care of you, average depositor. And this is what was done during the Reagan and Bush administrations with the I forget the name of the organization, but in any case, by Bill Seidman's organization that took over the failed savings and loans. So these are two ways historically that this has been done. Sweden has done one, and frankly, the United Kingdom is doing this. With nationalizing the bank, they did it with Northern Rock, and they're doing it with the Royal Bank of Scotland right now. And the other is for the government to run it through a bankruptcy process, as we did with the S&Ls, and it worked. These two things solve the problem. They're painful over the short term. Over the long term, they solve the problem. The third way to do it is what Japan did almost 20 years ago when their banks when Japan was on top of the world. There were all these books coming out about the Japanese conspiracy to take over the world, and the Japanese are coming. Martin Wolf wrote a great book on this. I think it was called The Japanese Conspiracy. And others and saying, the Japanese are going to rule the world. They've got all the money, blah, 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 blah. And their banks were just loaning money like crazy. And the yen was skyrocketing. The Japanese were the exporters to the world. And then China came in and undercut their labor and started competing with their manufacturers. And the South Koreans came in and started doing the same kind of trade practices that Japan was and ate their lunch. And Japan had this huge housing bubble, and the bubble crashed. And so what the Japanese government did was they started pumping public sector money, taxpayer dollars, into their banks, and they propped up their banks. And they're continuing to do this. And the result is that they've had what they refer to as the lost decade. It's longer than a decade now. It's like 15 years of basically one continuous, ongoing, god-awful recession. And the consequence of that has been that they've had government after government after government rise up and fall. Now, not the entire government, of course. Administrations, shall we say, political parties. They've all been coming and going. And there's been a lot of social ferment and social unrest. And this is a country with a very strong social safety net. Everybody in Japan has health care. Everybody in Japan has an old age pension. Everybody in Japan, very strong social safety net. And yet now Japan is starting to see homeless people on their streets. And that's the consequence of subsidizing the banks. Now, of these three options, the Obama administration, the Bush administration actually was the one that faced this crisis the first. And they chose option 3, subsidize the banks. Keep the millionaires and billionaires in place, keep them rich, pass taxpayer dollars to them, don't screw up the portfolios of the stockholders, keep the banks going. Don't do what Reagan and Bush did back in the 80s and back in the 80s with the S&Ls. Don't liquidate them. Don't nationalize them like the Swedes did and like the Brits are doing right now, but instead do what the Japanese did. And it didn't work for the Japanese. And now Barack Obama comes into power, and he brings with him, he takes on the Tim Geithner and Lawrence Summers, basically Clinton and Bush's advisors. And Tim Geithner takes on as his chief of staff the head lobbyist for Goldman Sachs. Tell me this makes sense. And here's Martin Wolf editorializing in the Financial Times yesterday. He asked the question, his opening sentence, is the U.S. Russia? And he points out that Simon Johnson asked this question, this guy who is, a former chief economist at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and a professor at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And here's what he says. He says the similarity is evident. Large inflows of foreign capital between the U.S. and Russia. Large inflows of foreign, and by the way, having been to Russia, several times before and after the fall of the Soviet Union, I can tell you, Russia is in one hell of a lot of pain right now. It's in a world of hurt. You got an oligarchy there that has essentially taken over the country. You've got a growing fascistic government. Medvedev and Putin are not small d Democrats by any stretch of the imagination. You've got a middle class that has shrunk to almost insignificance, and you've got pretty much everybody else is the working poor. Poverty is rampant. Homelessness is rampant. Alcoholism is among the highest in the world. It's the leading cause of death in Russia right now, or one of the leading causes. If not, it might be surpassed now by tuberculosis. AIDS is epidemic because drug abuse is epidemic. The public sector is falling apart. So here, the Financial Times. Is the U.S. Russia? The similarity is evident. Large inflows of foreign capital, torrid credit growth, excessive leverage, bubbles in asset prices, particularly property, and finally, asset price collapses and financial catastrophe. But, asks Professor Johnson, there's a deeper and more disturbing similarity between the U.S. and Russia. Elite business interests, financiers, in the case of the U.S., played a central role in creating the crisis, making ever larger gambles with the implicit backing of the government until the inevitable collapse. And then he goes on to point out that all this money that came to the financial sector created enormous wealth for the financial sector, and that wealth gave them political power, and they're using that political power to make sure that they are not kicked out on their cans like we did with the S&Ls and like the Swedes did with their bankers. Because in Sweden, the bankers couldn't buy an election. They couldn't buy the politicians. Martin Wolf points out in his column that in 2002, the financial sector generated an astonishing 41% of U.S. domestic corporate profits. 41% of all the profits of all the corporations in America came from companies that don't make a single product. You can't eat bonds. You can't sow a field with them. You can't drive them across the country. They make nothing. 41% of our profits? In 2008, as a consequence of this credit binge, U.S. private indebtedness, that's you and me, credit cards, houses, reached 285% of GDP. We privately owe almost 3 years' worth of this nation's output. And the financial sector debt was 121% of GDP in 2008. More than 100%. This, by the way, you can lay it all at the feet of the deregulators, which include Phil Gramm and Bill Clinton. And Martin Wolf said, deregulation generates growth of credit, the raw stuff the financial sector creates and on which it feeds. This cheap credit, this cheap money, trying to solve the problem that was created by cheap money with more cheap money is creating the potential for an absolute disaster. He said, so like Japan, the U.S. is caught between the elite's fear of bankruptcy and the public's loathing of bailouts.